"Look at you," Richard Whitmore sneered, his voice echoing across First National Bank's marble lobby. "Coming in here with your thrift store coat and fake card, thinking you can waste my time?" He gestured mockingly at the 90-year-old black woman standing before him. "This is a private institution for serious money, not some charity you wandered into off the street." Wealthy clients laughed behind designer handbags. Victoria Sterling whispered loudly, "Someone should call Adult Protective Services." The elderly woman, Margaret Bennett, stood perfectly still, her worn wooden cane trembling slightly. Her voice came out soft, but steady. "I just want to check my balance." Richard threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that made her flinch. "Security! Get this confused woman out before she embarrasses herself further." He had absolutely no idea that in 47 minutes, this woman would obliterate everything he'd spent his entire life building. Before we continue with what happened next, hit that subscribe button and stay until the very end because justice is about to be served in the most unexpected way. Comment below what city you're watching from so we can see how far Margaret's story travels. Now let's get back to the moment Richard Whitmore made the worst mistake of his life. Richard Whitmore had arrived at 7:45 that Tuesday morning, just like every other morning for the past 10 years. 52 years old, bank president, third generation to hold the position. His Italian shoes cost $3,000. His watch cost more than his secretary made in 6 months. He liked it that way. Visible proof of his superiority. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore," the security guard said. Richard didn't respond. Why would he? The man was paid to stand there and nod, nothing more. By 9:30, the lobby filled with the right kind of people. Investors, business owners, trust fund beneficiaries. Richard stood near the center, talking with Harrison Caldwell about their golf weekend in the Hamptons. Then the revolving door turned, and everything changed. An elderly black woman entered. Richard noticed her immediately. Wrong coat, wrong shoes, wrong everything. She didn't belong here, and he was going to make sure everyone knew it. She walked slowly across the lobby, her wooden cane tapping softly. Her eyes swept the space, and for just a second, something flickered across her face. Recognition? Memory? Richard didn't care. She approached the counter where Janet Reynolds, his assistant, was working. "Excuse me," the woman said. "I just want to check my balance." Janet looked up, then quickly glanced at Richard. The unspoken rule was clear. Process these people quickly and get them out. Richard decided to handle this himself. Make an example. Entertain his wealthy clients. Remind everyone who ran this bank. "Ma'am," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The woman turned to face him. Her eyes were striking, clear and deep. She studied him for a long moment. "No misunderstanding, young man," she said calmly. "I'm a client here. I'd like to check my account balance." Young man. Richard's jaw tightened. He was the president of this institution. This nobody was treating him like an errand boy. "This is a private banking institution," Richard said, his voice sharpening. "We serve a very specific clientele. Perhaps you're thinking of First Community Bank? 3 blocks south. Much more your speed." A few clients chuckled. Richard felt satisfaction surge through him. He was in control, demonstrating authority, putting someone in their place. The elderly woman didn't flinch. She reached into her coat and pulled out a black card. The edges were worn, the numbers faded. "I have an account here," she said simply. Richard took the card, barely looking at it before handing it back. "Ma'am, this looks like something from a promotional mailing. Scam companies prey on elderly people. It's quite sad, really." "I'm not confused," the woman said, steel creeping into her voice. My name is Margaret Bennett. I've banked here for 43 years.
I would like to check my balance.
Margaret Bennett. The name meant nothing. Richard glanced at Janet, who shrugged. Janet, we don't have time for this. We have actual clients waiting. He gestured toward Victoria Sterling, a socialite worth $80 million. Victoria was watching with barely concealed amusement. She leaned toward her companion. Poor thing, Victoria whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Probably has Alzheimer's. My housekeeper was the same way before we had to let her go. Margaret's eyes shifted to Victoria. That same flicker of recognition crossed her face. Young Hayes, Margaret said suddenly. Richard froze. Hayes, his middle name. His grandfather's surname before the family changed it to Whitmore for business purposes. Almost nobody knew that. What did you say? Richard's voice came out sharper than he intended. Your grandfather, Margaret continued, her voice steady and calm. Lawrence Hayes Whitmore. He preferred Hayes, said it sounded more distinguished. The lobby went quiet. Everyone was listening now. How do you know about my grandfather? Richard demanded. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I worked for him. 1955 through 1968. 13 years. Cleaned his office every evening after school, then full-time after I graduated. $40 a week, when he remembered to pay me. Richard felt the floor shift beneath his feet. His grandfather had died 20 years ago. The official family history was carefully managed. Lawrence Hayes Whitmore, self-made banking titan, generous philanthropist. There were portraits of him in the boardroom, plaques with his name, stories of his genius. You're lying, Richard said, but his voice cracked. Your grandfather had a scar on his left hand, Margaret said, her eyes locked on Richard's face. Between his thumb and forefinger, shaped like a crescent moon. He told everyone he got it trimming rose bushes. That was a lie. Richard's mouth went dry. He'd seen that scar hundreds of times as a child. The rosebush story was repeated so often it became fact. How did he really get it? The question escaped before Richard could stop himself. Margaret's expression hardened. I was 17. He'd been drinking, like most afternoons. I'd missed a spot dusting one of his bookshelves. He grabbed a crystal paperweight, raised it above his head, told me he was going to teach me what happens to lazy girls who don't do their jobs. Victoria Sterling had stopped smiling. Janet had stopped pretending to work. Everyone was frozen. I moved, Margaret continued. The paperweight hit his desk and shattered. Glass cut his hand. Blood everywhere. He screamed at me to clean it, bandage him, never speak of it. Then he docked my pay for the broken paperweight and the bloodstains on his carpet. Richard felt sick. That's not true. My grandfather was respected, a good man. Your grandfather told me on my 18th birthday that people like me should be grateful for the opportunity to serve people like him, Margaret said quietly. He said it was the natural order. Some people born to lead, others born to follow, and I should know my place. Richard's face flushed red. Those exact words. His grandfather had said them often. Richard himself believed them, built his entire worldview around them. You're making this up, Richard insisted, his voice rising. You looked up my family history online, and now you're trying to embarrass me. Margaret reached into her handbag. She pulled out a small, faded photograph and held it up. The photograph showed a young black woman, 18 or 19, standing in an office. Behind a desk sat a white man in his 50s, stern and imposing. The office was unmistakable. The same wood paneling, the same bookshelves, the same windows that now made up Richard's 10th floor office. That's your grandfather's office, Margaret said. That's me on my last day, October 12th, 1968. I'd finally saved enough to quit and go to college. Your grandfather told me I was wasting my time. Said education wouldn't change what I was. Richard stared at the photograph. Everything she said had the terrible ring of truth. His grandfather had been a man of his time, shaped by prejudices the family worked hard to bury, to sanitize, to erase from the official history. "Security!" Richard shouted. "Remove this woman immediately. She's harassing me with false accusations." Two security guards approached. They looked uncomfortable. One of them, Marcus, had worked at the bank for 15 years. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus said quietly, "maybe we should verify her account first." "I don't pay you to think," Richard snapped. "I pay you to follow orders. Get her out. Now." Margaret didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hand resting on her cane, her eyes fixed on Richard. "Young man," she said softly, "you have a choice. Listen and learn something about your family's real history and treat me with basic dignity. Or continue down this path and discover just how badly you've misjudged this situation." Richard laughed, harsh and bitter. "Are you threatening me? You? In my bank?" "I'm not threatening you," Margaret replied. "I'm offering you wisdom, something your grandfather never had." "If she's not out of this building in 60 seconds, you're both fired," Richard told the guards. Marcus and his partner exchanged glances. Slowly, they moved toward Margaret. "Ma'am," Marcus said gently, apologetically, "I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave." Margaret looked at him with sad understanding. "I know you're just doing your job, son. I don't hold it against you." Then she laughed. Not nervous, not defeated, deep and genuine, like it came from somewhere ancient and unshakable. "What's so funny?" Richard demanded. Margaret looked at him, still smiling. "In about 5 minutes, you're going to wish you'd listened. You're going to wish you'd treated me with respect. You're going to wish you'd been a better man than your grandfather." "Get her out!" Richard shouted. The guards reached for Margaret's arms. Before they could touch her, the elevator chimed softly. The doors opened. David Morrison stepped out. 60 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, but not flashy. David Morrison was a legend. Started as a teller in Brooklyn, worked through night school, earned his MBA from Columbia, spent 4 decades building a reputation as one of the most ethical executives in banking. 5 years ago, First National recruited him as Senior Vice President and Chief Operations Officer. He was also a founding board member, which meant he had authority over everyone, including Richard. The moment David appeared, the atmosphere changed. People straightened. Conversations stopped. Richard felt anxiety spike in his chest. David rarely came downstairs during business hours. David's eyes swept the lobby. 2 security guards surrounding an elderly black woman, Richard red-faced and angry. Wealthy clients watching like it was entertainment. "Richard," David said calmly, his voice soft but carrying. "What's happening here?" Richard forced a smile. "Nothing to worry about, David. Just a confused woman with a fake card. Having security escort her out." David walked closer, his eyes on the elderly woman. As he approached, his expression changed. Surprise, then joy, then something that looked like reverence. "Margaret?" he said softly. The elderly woman smiled, genuine and warm this time. "Hello, David. It's been too long." David crossed the distance quickly and embraced her gently. "Mrs. Bennett, I had no idea you were coming in today. If I'd known, I would have greeted you personally." Richard felt the world tilt. Mrs. Bennett? David knew her? How? David turned to Richard. The warmth in his expression evaporated instantly. "Richard, my office. Now." "David, I can explain." "Now," David repeated, his voice iron.
Richard's mouth went dry. He glanced around. Everyone was staring at him. Not with amusement anymore. With something else. Pity? Disgust? His skin crawled. David turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Bennet, I apologize for whatever happened. Janet, please escort Mrs. Bennet to the executive lounge. Get her whatever she needs. I'll be with her shortly." Janet nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Right this way, Mrs. Bennet." Margaret paused. She looked at Richard one last time. In her eyes, he saw something that terrified him. Patience. Not anger. Not vengeance. Just patient certainty that justice would unfold. David gestured toward the elevator. "Richard, the elevator ride felt like descending into hell, even though they were going up." David stood perfectly still, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't speak. Didn't look at Richard. The silence suffocated. When the doors opened, David walked straight to his office. Richard hurried after him, his mind spinning with excuses, explanations. David sat behind his desk and gestured for Richard to sit. Richard did, feeling like a child called to the principal. "Do you know who that woman is?" David asked quietly. "She said Margaret Bennet. She claims she worked for my grandfather, but—" "She's not lying," David interrupted. "Margaret Bennet taught 8th grade mathematics at Public School 127 in Brooklyn. 1972 through 2012. 40 years in one of the most challenging, underfunded schools in the city." Richard blinked. "She was a teacher?" "One of the best I've ever known," David said. "I was in her class in '82. 13 years old, angry at the world, convinced I was going nowhere because that's what everyone told me. Poor kid from a broken home. Father in prison. Mother working 3 jobs. David leaned forward. "Margaret Bennet saw something in me nobody else saw. She stayed after school to tutor me. She paid for my SAT prep out of her own pocket. She wrote my college recommendation letters. She called me every week my first semester to make sure I was keeping up." Richard's stomach churned. "When I graduated Columbia with my MBA," David said, emotion thick in his voice, "Margaret was the first person I called. You know what she said?" Richard shook his head. "She said, 'I knew you could do it, David. I never doubted you. Now go prove to the world what I already know. Greatness has nothing to do with where you start, and everything to do with how hard you're willing to work." Silence filled the office. Richard could hear his heartbeat. "You just tried to humiliate my mentor in front of a lobby full of people," David said softly. "You called her confused, accused her of fraud, ordered security to remove her like trash." "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," David cut him off. "You didn't verify. You didn't treat her with basic dignity. You saw an elderly black woman in an inexpensive coat and decided she didn't belong. Decided she wasn't worth your time. Decided she wasn't worthy of respect." Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. David stood and walked to the window. "Margaret Bennet isn't just my former teacher, Richard. She's one of this bank's most important clients." "What do you mean?" David turned back. There was something terrible in his expression. Disappointment. "You're about to find out." "David, please, I made a mistake. I'll apologize. I'll make it right." "Do you know what Margaret did with her teaching salary for 40 years? David asked. Richard shook his head. "She saved and invested 60% of every paycheck, lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, drove a 1998 Honda until it died, wore clothes until they fell apart, bought groceries on sale, never took vacations, never went to restaurants, never bought anything unnecessary." David's voice grew harder, not because she was cheap, not because she didn't deserve better, but because she was building something bigger than herself. "I don't understand,"
Richard whispered. She was investing, Richard, in index funds, in blue-chip stocks, in municipal bonds. Year after year, decade after decade, 60% of her salary went into investments. David walked back to his desk and pulled out a file. And when she retired in 2012, do you know what she did with all that money? Richard couldn't speak. She created a scholarship fund, David said. Full rides for students from underprivileged backgrounds. Students everyone else gave up on. Students the system failed. She's sent 427 kids to college in the last 13 years. MIT. Stanford, Howard University, Yale, Columbia. Full tuition, books, housing, living expenses. Richard felt weak. Engineers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, scientists, David continued, all because a woman who earned a teacher's salary decided that lifting others mattered more than luxury. How was I supposed to know? Richard's voice came out as a whisper. Because you should have asked before you humiliated her in public, David said. Because leaders don't judge customers by their clothes or appearance. Because your job is to serve, not to entertain your wealthy friends by destroying someone's dignity. David picked up his phone. I'm calling an emergency board meeting, 5 p.m. today. You're suspended immediately while we investigate this incident and your overall leadership. David, you can't. I have responsibilities. A family. Bills. Margaret Bennett is 90 years old, David said, his voice cutting like a knife. She spent her whole life proving that human dignity isn't for sale. Every investment she made, every child she helped, every dollar she earned, all of it came because she refused to let people like you decide her worth. David dialed a number. The difference between you and her is simple, Richard. You use your power to make people feel small. She uses hers to lift people up. You use power to control. She uses it to create opportunity. The phone rang on speaker. David Morrison, calling for emergency board session, David said into the phone. We have a serious situation that requires immediate attention. Richard slumped in his chair. Through the office window, he could see down into the lobby. Margaret Bennett sat in one of the leather chairs, calm and dignified, talking with Janet. Wealthy clients who'd laughed earlier now kept their distance, shame written across their faces. Victoria Sterling approached Margaret slowly, her usual confidence gone. Even from 10 floors up, Richard could see her apologizing, her hands trembling. David hung up the phone. Every board member will be here at 5. You need to leave the building until then. David. Now, Richard. Richard stood on shaking legs. As he walked toward the door, David said one more thing. You had a chance to be better than your grandfather. You chose to be exactly like him. That's the tragedy here. Richard left the office. In the hallway, he saw his reflection in the glass. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a powerful bank president. He saw a small, cruel man who'd just destroyed his own career because he couldn't see past his prejudices. Downstairs, Margaret pulled out her phone. She'd been recording since the moment she walked in. Every word, every insult, every humiliation, all captured in perfect clarity. Janet saw the phone and her eyes widened. Mrs. Bennett, have you been— Technology is remarkable, isn't it? Margaret said gently. I believe the board of directors should see this. They deserve to know what kind of leadership is guiding their institution. Janet swallowed hard. She'd witnessed everything. She'd stood there and let it happen. Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry. I should have helped you. I should have checked your account. I should have— Dear, you were following the culture this bank created, Margaret said kindly. A culture where appearance matters more than character, where wealth determines worth, where dignity is only extended to those who look like they deserve it. She smiled softly. But cultures can change. Sometimes they just need the right catalyst. Victoria Sterling stood nearby, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Bennet, I was cruel. I said terrible things. There's no excuse. Margaret looked at her. Mrs. Sterling, I remember you from when you were 15 years old. Your family hired me to clean their Manhattan apartment every Saturday. You used to leave messes deliberately to see if I'd complain, just like your grandfather did. Victoria's face crumpled. I'm so ashamed. Shame is only useful if it leads to change, Margaret said. The question is, what will you do differently tomorrow? Security guard Marcus approached, his head down. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have verified your account before I let Mr. Whitmore intimidate me. You have a family to feed, Margaret said gently. I understand the impossible position he put you in. That's why systems need to change, not just individuals. David Morrison appeared from the elevator. He walked straight to Margaret and sat beside her. The board will be here at 5, he said. Richard's been suspended. This will be investigated thoroughly. Margaret nodded. Good. But David, this isn't just about Richard. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. A culture that trains employees to judge people by their clothes instead of their character. I know, David said. And we're going to change it, starting today. Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out that black card again, the one Richard had dismissed as fake. Now, she said with a small smile, would someone please help me check my balance? That's all I came here to do. Janet stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. Of course, Mrs. Bennet, right away. She took the card, entered the information carefully, and pulled up the account. Her eyes widened. Her hand flew to her mouth. Mrs. Bennet, Janet whispered, would you like me to read this privately or— Out loud, dear, Margaret said calmly. Transparency matters, especially in banking. Janet took a deep breath. The balance in your primary checking account is $847,000. The lobby went silent. A few gasps. Victoria Sterling's handbag hit the floor with a loud thud. But dear, Margaret said gently, isn't that only one account? Janet checked again, her fingers shaking. Yes, you also have an education savings fund with $1.2 million, an investment portfolio with $3.8 million, and— she had to read it twice. An educational endowment fund with $12.4 million. Total silence. Actual, complete silence. $18.2 million. Sitting quietly under the name of the woman Richard had tried to throw out of the bank. And upstairs, watching from his office window, Richard Whitmore finally understood the full scope of what he'd done. He hadn't just insulted a millionaire. He'd attacked someone who'd spent her entire life using wealth to lift others. Someone more honorable than he'd ever been. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. And it was nobody's fault but his own. Margaret sat calmly in the lobby, surrounded by people who now looked at her with respect, with awe, with shame for how they'd judged her. She'd walked in just wanting to check her balance. She was leaving, having changed an entire institution. Janet's hands shook as she read the next number. Education Savings Fund, $1.2 million. Her voice cracked. Investment portfolio, $3.8 million. She had to pause, had to breathe. Educational Endowment Fund, $12.4 million. The lobby exploded. A woman gasped so loudly it sounded like a scream. Someone's coffee cup shattered on the marble floor. A man in a $5,000 suit stumbled backward, his face white as paper. Victoria Sterling's legs gave out. She sank onto the nearest chair, her designer handbag forgotten on the floor. 18 million, she whispered.
$18.2 million. The woman they'd mocked, the woman they'd assumed was confused, poor, lost. She had more money than most of them would see in 10 lifetimes. Margaret sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her cane. No triumph in her expression, no smugness, just quiet dignity. "Thank you, Janet," she said softly. "That's exactly what I came to check." Janet couldn't move, couldn't speak. She'd stood there and watched Richard humiliate this woman. She'd done nothing to stop it. $18 million. $18 million. Harrison Caldwell, the real estate developer who'd been laughing with Richard 30 minutes ago, approached slowly. His arrogance had evaporated completely. "Mrs. Bennett, I apologize. What happened here was inexcusable." Margaret looked at him. "Mr. Caldwell, I remember your father. He owned the building where I lived in Brooklyn, 1973. He tried to evict my mother and me because he wanted to renovate and charge higher rent. We'd lived there 18 years, never missed a payment." Harrison's face went red. "I didn't know. Your father told my mother that people like us were holding back progress," Margaret continued, "that we should be grateful he'd let us stay as long as he had. We fought the eviction. It took 2 years and most of our savings, but we won. The judge ruled in our favor." She smiled sadly. "Your father's company went bankrupt 4 years later. Bad investments, poor decisions, karma, some might say." Harrison backed away slowly, shame written across every feature. Another client, an older man Margaret hadn't addressed, stepped forward. "Mrs. Bennett, my name is Thomas Chen. I don't know if you remember me, but you taught my daughter Angela in 1998. She was struggling badly. You stayed after school twice a week for a year to help her." Margaret's expression softened. "Angela Chen, of course I remember. Brilliant girl. Terrible test anxiety." "She's a pediatric surgeon now," Thomas said, his voice thick. "Because of you. Because you saw something in her and refused to give up." He paused. "I'm ashamed of myself for standing here and watching what happened. I should have spoken up." "Speaking up now matters too," Margaret said gently. Upstairs, Richard stood frozen at his office window. He'd watched everything. Watched the lobby transform. Watched his clients, his wealthy, powerful clients, apologize to a woman he'd tried to throw out. His phone buzzed. Text from his wife. "Channel 7 just called, asking for comment about an incident at the bank. What's going on?" Richard's stomach dropped. The media already knew. Someone had called them. Of course they had. A 90-year-old black woman humiliated by a white bank president? This would be everywhere by evening news. Another text. This one from his brother. "Just saw a video on Twitter. Is that you yelling at an elderly woman? What the hell, Richard?" Video. Richard's hands started shaking. Video meant proof. Video meant evidence. Video meant there was no way to spin this, no way to control the narrative. He tried calling his brother. No answer. Tried his wife. No answer. Tried his lawyer. Voicemail. Everyone was already distancing themselves. Downstairs, Margaret pulled out her phone. The recording had been running since she walked in. Every word Richard said. Every cruel laugh. Every dismissive gesture. All captured in perfect, high-definition clarity. "Technology truly is remarkable," she said, showing the screen to Janet. "I started recording the moment he called me confused. I've learned over 90 years that proof matters more than truth when dealing with people in power." Janet stared at the video. She could see herself in the background, standing there, doing nothing. Complicit through silence. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry," Janet whispered. "I should have helped you immediately. I should have checked your account. I should have stood up to him."
Janet, how long have you worked here? Margaret asked. 11 years. And in those 11 years, how many times has Richard Whitmore made you feel small? How many times has he dismissed your ideas? How many times has he taken credit for your work? Janet's eyes filled with tears. Too many times to count.
Then you're a victim too, Margaret said.
The culture he created doesn't just hurt clients. It hurts employees. It hurts everyone except him. The main doors opened. David Morrison walked in, followed by an older woman in her 70s. She was black, elegantly dressed, carrying herself with unmistakable authority. "Margaret," the woman said warmly, "David called me. I came immediately." Margaret stood, embracing her. "Lorraine, I should have known David would call you." Janet leaned toward another teller. "Who is that?" "Lorraine Washington," the teller whispered back. "Board member, former federal judge, one of the most powerful women in New York." Lorraine turned to the lobby, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "I want everyone who witnessed what happened here to stay. The board is convening an emergency meeting, and will need statements." People shifted uncomfortably. Nobody wanted to admit they'd watched and done nothing. Nobody wanted to be associated with this disaster. "I saw everything," Thomas Chen said, stepping forward. "I'll give a statement." Victoria Sterling stood slowly. "So will I." One by one, others followed. Not everyone. Some clients slipped quietly toward the exits, hoping to avoid involvement. But enough stayed, enough witnesses to make this official. The elevator chimed again. Another board member emerged. Then another. By 4:30, 7 of the 9 board members had arrived, all called by David Morrison, all briefed on what happened. Richard watched from above as they gathered in the lobby around Margaret. They treated her like visiting royalty. One board member, an elderly white man named Robert Fletcher, knelt beside her chair to speak with her at eye level. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time, it was David. "Board meeting. Conference room. Now." Richard's legs barely held him as he walked to the conference room. The massive mahogany table could seat 20. Today, 9 board members sat on one side. An empty chair waited on the other side. For him. Alone. He sat down, feeling like a defendant at trial. David Morrison stood at the head of the table. "This emergency session has been called to address a serious incident involving Bank President Richard Whitmore and client Margaret Bennett." "I can explain," Richard started.
You'll have your chance,
Lorraine Washington cut him off. "But first, we're going to watch something." She nodded to David, who connected his laptop to the large screen on the wall. Margaret's recording began to play. Richard watched himself on screen, watched himself dismiss Margaret, mock her, call her confused, order security to remove her. Every cruel word, every contemptuous laugh, every moment of his arrogance displayed in brutal clarity. The board members watched in silence. Some took notes, some closed their eyes, unable to watch. One woman shook her head slowly, disgust clear on her face. When the video ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, Robert Fletcher, who'd been on the board for 32 years, broke the silence. "In 3 decades of banking, I have never seen anything so appalling." "Mr. Whitmore," Lorraine Washington said, her voice cold as winter, "do you have anything to say?" Richard's mouth was dry. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know about her accounts. If I'd known, if you'd known she was wealthy, you would have treated her with respect?" Lorraine's eyebrows raised. "That's your defense?" "No, you meant exactly what you said," another board member interrupted. "You judge people by their appearance, by their clothes, by whether they look like they deserve your time." Richard tried again. "This bank has standards. We cater to a specific clientele.
Our standards include treating every human being with dignity, David Morrison said. That's not negotiable. She came in with a worn-out card, Richard protested. She looked confused. Anyone would have thought. Anyone racist would have thought that, Lorraine Washington said flatly. Anyone who believes wealth determines worth would have thought that. Anyone who learned nothing from the civil rights movement would have thought that. Richard felt sweat dripping down his back. I'm not racist. I've never— You're exactly like your grandfather, David said. Margaret told you that in the lobby. She worked for Lawrence Hayes Whitmore. She saw how he treated people he considered beneath him, and you proved her right. Robert Fletcher leaned forward. Mrs. Bennett isn't just a client, Richard. She's been quietly supporting this bank's community programs for years. Last year alone, she donated $400,000 to our financial literacy initiative. Richard's face went white. He'd cut funding to that program 6 months ago, called it wasteful spending. He'd reassign those resources to the executive bonus pool. You didn't know that, Robert continued, because you never bothered to learn who your major donors were. You were too busy courting wealthy investors who contribute nothing but deposits. Another board member, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, spoke up. I need to share something. She looked directly at Richard. 23 years ago, I was a struggling single mother, working 2 jobs to pay for community college. Margaret Bennett was my professor. She didn't just teach me accounting. She paid for my textbooks. She babysat my daughter so I could study for finals. She wrote recommendation letters that got me into Columbia Business School. Patricia's voice shook with emotion. Everything I have, everything I've achieved, exists because Margaret Bennett saw potential in an exhausted black woman who most people dismissed. Just like you dismissed her today. Richard stared at her. Patricia Okonkwo was worth $90 million. She sat on boards of 6 major corporations. She was one of the most respected business leaders in New York. How many others? Richard whispered. How many other what? David asked. How many other people has she helped? David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We actually looked into that while you were in your office, panicking. Margaret Bennett has directly mentored or financially supported over 800 people in the last 40 years. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, entrepreneurs, people who are now running companies, teaching at universities, serving in government. He pulled out a folder. We found 12 people working at this bank right now who were her students at some point. 12. Including Janet Reynolds, your own assistant. Did you know Janet graduated top of her class from NYU's business school? No, of course you didn't. You've never asked about her education or career goals. You treat her like a secretary instead of the talented analyst she is. Richard felt like the room was closing in on him. Everything he thought he knew was collapsing. Lorraine Washington stood up. Mr. Whitmore, this board has a decision to make. But before we vote, I want you to understand something. This isn't just about what happened today. This is about a pattern of behavior, a culture of elitism and discrimination you've cultivated at this institution. She walked around the table, her heels clicking against the floor. We've received 17 formal complaints about your leadership in the past year. Employees reporting hostile work environment. Clients reporting differential treatment based on race and ethnicity. We ignored them. We told ourselves you were just old-fashioned, just demanding, just maintaining standards. She stopped directly in front of Richard. We were wrong. We enabled you. And that ends today. Lorraine, please, Richard begged. I'll do better. I'll change. I'll take sensitivity training, diversity courses, whatever you want. Please don't fire me. Sensitivity training? Patricia Okonkwo laughed bitterly. You're 52 years old. If you haven't learned basic human decency by now, a training course won't help. Robert Fletcher cleared his throat. The board needs to vote. All in favor of immediate termination of Richard Whitmore as bank president, with forfeiture of severance package
and immediate removal from all positions. Say aye. 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 One by one, every board member voted. 9-0. Unanimous.
Richard Whitmore, you are terminated, effective immediately, Lorraine Washington said. Security will escort you from the building. You have 15 minutes to collect personal items from your office. Any company property must remain.
Richard stood on shaking legs. This is unfair. You're overreacting. One mistake and you're destroying my career? One mistake? David Morrison's voice rose for the first time. You humiliated a 90-year-old woman in public. You abused your authority. You created a toxic culture. You damaged this institution's reputation. And even now, standing here facing the consequences, you're calling it one mistake? He shook his head. You still don't understand what you did wrong. That's the real problem. 2 security guards entered. Marcus, the same guard who'd been ordered to remove Margaret earlier, looked uncomfortable. Mr. Whitmore, Marcus said quietly, I need you to come with me. Richard looked around the table one last time. No sympathy, no second chances, nothing. He'd walked into this building that morning as president. He was leaving as nothing. The walk to his office felt endless. Employees who usually smiled and deferred to him now avoided eye contact. Word had spread fast. Everyone knew. Richard grabbed his family photos, his degrees, his awards. Meaningless now, tainted by how he'd earned them. His phone buzzed constantly. News alerts. His name was trending on Twitter. The video had gone viral. 6 million views and climbing. Mr. Whitmore, Marcus said gently, time's up. We need to go. Richard took one last look at his office. His grandfather's office. 3 generations of Whitmores had worked from this room. He was the last. The legacy ended with him. Ended in disgrace. Downstairs, Margaret sat in the executive lounge with the board members. They wanted her input on next steps, on rebuilding the bank's culture, on making sure this never happened again. The problem isn't just one person, Margaret said thoughtfully. The problem is a system that rewards discrimination, that promotes people who protect wealth over people who serve communities. Lorraine Washington nodded. What would you change? Margaret smiled. I'd start by promoting Janet Reynolds to Executive Vice President of Client Services. She's brilliant, compassionate, and she's been overlooked for 11 years because Richard Whitmore took credit for her work. David Morrison was already typing notes. Done. What else? Mandatory training for all employees on implicit bias, Margaret continued. Not because training solves everything, but because it starts conversations. It makes people think about assumptions they didn't know they had. Patricia Okonkwo added, we should also review lending practices. Make sure loan approvals aren't being denied based on bias. And hire a chief diversity officer, Robert Fletcher suggested. Someone with real authority to investigate complaints and enforce accountability. Margaret listened to them planning, strategizing, trying to fix what Richard had broken. But she knew real change took more than policies. Real change required people willing to admit they'd been wrong and do better. The elevator chimed. Richard emerged, flanked by security, carrying a cardboard box of his belongings. He saw Margaret across the lobby. Their eyes met. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, just looked at him with something that might have been pity. Richard wanted to say something. Apologize, explain, beg for forgiveness. But what words could possibly matter now? He walked toward the exit. Clients who'd once competed for his attention now turned away. The lobby that had been his kingdom was foreign territory now. As he reached the revolving door, he heard Margaret's voice one last time. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. I hope you learned something from this.
she said quietly. "I hope you become the man your grandfather never was. It's not too late for that." Then she turned back to her conversation with the board members, dismissing him as easily as he'd dismissed her hours ago. Richard stepped out onto the street. The afternoon sun felt too bright, traffic too loud, the world too big and unforgiving. His phone buzzed. His wife, finally calling back. "Richard, I'm leaving, taking the kids to my mother's. Don't come home tonight. My lawyer will contact you about separation proceedings." The call ended before he could respond. Separated, fired, humiliated, destroyed. All because he'd judged someone by their coat instead of their character. All because he'd learned cruelty from his grandfather and called it leadership. All because he'd believed wealth determined worth. Richard walked down the street, anonymous in a crowd that wouldn't recognize him tomorrow. The bank president was gone. What remained was just a man who'd wasted his power on making others feel small. Behind him, inside the bank, Margaret Bennett was already changing things, already making sure the next person who walked through those doors would be treated with dignity, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. Justice had been served. But more than that, a foundation had been laid for something better. The news vans arrived within an hour.
Channel 7, Fox, CNN, all parked outside First National Bank, cameras aimed at the entrance like weapons. Reporters shouted questions at anyone leaving the building. Inside, Margaret sat in the executive lounge, watching the chaos through the window. David Morrison stood beside her, his phone ringing non-stop. "Mrs. Bennett, we need to decide how to handle this," he said. "The media is going to tear us apart if we don't get ahead of the story." "Tell them the truth," Margaret said simply. "That's all you ever need to do." Lorraine Washington entered, followed by Patricia Okonkwo. "Margaret, we'd like you to do a press conference with us. Show a united front. Show that this bank stands for something better." Margaret shook her head. "This isn't about me. This is about fixing what's broken. Let the media focus on the changes you're making, not on an old woman who just wanted to check her balance." "But the video is everywhere," Patricia said. "People want to hear from you." "They want to know your story." "My story has been told 1,000 times," Margaret replied. "Poor black woman works hard, gets disrespected, proves her worth through money. That's not the lesson here." She stood, leaning on her cane. "The lesson is that every person who walks through those doors deserves dignity. Rich or poor, black or white, young or old. That's what you need to say." David nodded slowly. "You're right. This isn't about one incident. It's about systemic change." "Then start changing," Margaret said. "Right now. Today. Don't wait for the news cycle to move on. Don't wait for people to forget. Act."
Lorraine pulled out her phone. "Janet Reynolds. Where is she?" "Still at her desk," David said, working like nothing happened. "Bring her here," Lorraine commanded. 5 minutes later, Janet entered the lounge, nervous and confused. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged. "Janet," Lorraine said gently, "sit down." Janet sat, her hands trembling. "Am I being fired? I know I should have helped Mrs. Bennett. I should have stood up to Richard. I'm so sorry." "You're not being fired," Patricia interrupted. "You're being promoted." Janet blinked. "What?" "Executive Vice President of Client Services," David said. "Effective immediately. Salary $240,000. Full benefits. Stock options. Your own office on the 15th floor." Janet's mouth opened. No sound came out. "You've worked here 11 years, Lorraine continued. "You've done excellent work that Richard took credit for. You've trained 7 new employees who all moved up while you stayed in the same position. That ends today.
Tears streamed down Janet's face. "I don't understand. Why now? Why me?" Margaret spoke softly. "Because talent deserves recognition. Because hard work should be rewarded. Because you've earned this 100 times over." Janet turned to Margaret, sobbing. "I didn't help you. I stood there and let him humiliate you. I don't deserve this." "Janet, you were trapped in a toxic system," Margaret said. "You did what you needed to survive. I don't hold that against you. But now you have power. The question is, what will you do with it?" Janet wiped her eyes. "I'll make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else. I swear it." "Then you're the right person for this job," Lorraine said. The door opened again. Marcus, the security guard, stood there awkwardly. "Mr. Morrison, the press is demanding a statement. They're not leaving." David sighed. "I'll handle it." He looked at the board members. "Come with me. We're doing this together." They walked to the lobby entrance. Outside, at least 30 reporters crowded the sidewalk, cameras ready, microphones extended. David stepped outside. The shouting started immediately. "Mr. Morrison, is it true your bank president was fired for racial discrimination? Did Margaret Bennett really have $18 million? Will there be legal action against Richard Whitmore?" David raised his hand. Silence fell gradually. "Today, First National Bank failed one of our clients," he said clearly. "Margaret Bennett, a valued member of our community and a respected educator, was treated with disrespect and discrimination by our former president. This is unacceptable. It violates everything we claim to stand for." He paused, letting that sink in. "Richard Whitmore has been terminated. But firing one person doesn't fix a broken culture, so we're implementing immediate changes." Lorraine stepped forward. "First, we're creating a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer position with full authority to investigate complaints and enforce accountability. Second, we're reviewing all lending and account management practices to ensure equity. Third, we're mandating bias training for every employee, top to bottom." Patricia added, "We're also establishing a community advisory board. Real people from neighborhoods we serve, giving us direct feedback. No more decisions made in ivory towers by people disconnected from reality." A reporter shouted, "What about Margaret Bennett? Is she suing the bank?" "Mrs. Bennett wants what we all should want," David said. "A better system, a fairer institution, a bank that serves everyone equally." "Will she accept a settlement?" David smiled. "Mrs. Bennett doesn't need our money. She has plenty of her own. What she needs is for us to do better, and that's exactly what we're going to do." The press conference continued for 20 minutes. Every board member spoke. Every one of them acknowledged failure and committed to change. Inside, Margaret watched on the lobby television. Janet stood beside her, still processing her promotion. "Do you think they mean it?" Janet asked. "Do you think they'll really change things?" "Some will," Margaret said. "Some won't. But enough will try, and that's how change happens. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, with enough people refusing to accept the old ways." Her phone rang, an unknown number. She answered anyway. "Mrs. Bennett, this is Marcus Williams from the New York Times. I'd love to interview you about—" "No, thank you," Margaret said politely, and hung up. It rang again. CNN. She declined. ABC. Declined. The Washington Post. Declined. "Why aren't you talking to them?" Janet asked. "This is your chance to tell your story." "My story has been told," Margaret repeated. "Every black woman my age has a version of this story. What matters now is making sure the next generation doesn't have to live it." Victoria Sterling appeared in the lobby entrance, hesitant. She'd gone home earlier, overwhelmed and ashamed. Now she was back.
Mrs. Bennet, Victoria said quietly, may I speak with you? Privately? Margaret nodded. They moved to a quiet corner. Victoria couldn't meet her eyes. I need to ask you something. When you worked for my grandfather, when I was 15, did I really leave messes deliberately? Yes, Margaret said gently. Victoria's face crumpled. I was horrible. I knew you had to clean them up. I knew it was cruel. But everyone in my family treated staff that way, and I thought it was normal. I thought it was what people like us did. You were 15, Margaret said. Children learn what they're taught. That's not an excuse, Victoria whispered. I'm 47 years old now. I've had 32 years to become a better person, and instead, I just became a richer version of my 15-year-old self. She pulled out her checkbook. I want to donate to your scholarship fund. I want to help. I know money doesn't erase what I did, but how much? Margaret asked. Victoria wrote quickly, her hands shaking. She tore out the check and handed it over. Margaret looked at it. $5 million. Victoria, this is too much. It's not enough, Victoria said. It will never be enough to make up for how I've lived. But it's a start. She paused. And I want to do more. I want to volunteer. I want to mentor students. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Do you mean that? Because volunteering when the cameras are watching is easy. Showing up when no one's paying attention is what matters. I mean it, Victoria said firmly. I swear I do. Then we'll find a place for you, Margaret said. She folded the check carefully. This will send 50 students to college. 50 lives changed because you chose to be better. Victoria started crying, the kind of crying that comes from years of guilt finally released. Across town, Richard Whitmore sat in his car outside his house. His wife had changed the locks. His belongings were in boxes on the front porch. A note taped to the door. Lawyer will contact you. Don't call me. His phone buzzed. Another news alert. His face on every channel. His name trending worldwide. Racist banker was the kindest description he was seeing. He'd received 47 emails in the past hour. All of them rejections. Every job application, every networking contact, every person he'd thought was a friend. All gone. The banking world was small. Word traveled fast. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. He thought about his grandfather, Lawrence Hayes Whitmore, the man he'd idolized, the man whose portrait hung in the boardroom, whose name was on plaques, whose reputation Richard had spent his life trying to honor. What if Margaret was right? What if his grandfather wasn't a titan of industry, but just a cruel man who'd been allowed to succeed because the system protected people like him? What if Richard had spent his entire life becoming someone he should have been ashamed of? His phone rang. His mother. She was 83, living in assisted care. Richard, I saw the news, she said without greeting. Your father would be so disappointed. Mom, I can explain. Don't, she cut him off. I watched the video. I saw what you did. I saw who you've become. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. Your father spent his whole life trying to be better than his father, trying to make up for what Lawrence did. And you threw all of that away. Dad never told me grandfather was like that, Richard protested. Because he was ashamed, his mother said. Because he wanted to protect you from that legacy. But I told him we needed to be honest with you about the family history. He thought he could teach you through example instead of words. She sighed, a sound of infinite sadness. I guess we were both wrong. The call ended. Richard sat there, his whole world collapsed around him. No job, no wife, no respect, no future.
He thought about driving off a bridge, about ending it all, about escaping this nightmare the only way that seemed possible. But then he remembered Margaret's last words to him. "It's not too late." Was it true? Could he still become someone better? Or had he destroyed any chance of redemption? Back at the bank, the board meeting continued into the evening. Policies were being rewritten, procedures redesigned. Every aspect of how the bank operated was being examined and questioned. "We need to address loan approval disparities," one board member said. "The data shows clear bias.
Black applicants with identical credit scores and income levels are denied at twice the rate of white applicants."
"How did we not know this?" Lorraine demanded.
"We knew," David admitted quietly. "We just called it risk management instead of discrimination." The room fell silent. "That changes now," Patricia said firmly. "We publish approval data publicly. We hold ourselves accountable. Transparency forces honesty." Margaret had been invited to observe the meeting.
She sat quietly, listening as they debated and discussed and planned. Finally, Robert Fletcher turned to her.
"Mrs. Bennett, we need your help. We need someone who understands both banking and community needs. Someone who's lived the discrimination we're trying to fix."
"I'm 90 years old," Margaret said. "I'm not sure how much help I can be."
"We want you on the board," Lorraine said. "Full voting member, full authority. We need your voice, your perspective, your wisdom."
Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I've spent my whole life teaching, helping, guiding. I'm tired."
"We know," Patricia said gently. "But this is different. This is a chance to change an entire institution, to create a model other banks will follow, to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Margaret looked around the table. 9 successful people, all looking at her with genuine respect, genuine need. "I'll accept on one condition," she said finally.
"Janet Reynolds joins the board too. She understands this bank from the inside. She knows what needs to change at the operational level."
"Done," Lorraine said immediately.
"Anything else?"
"Yes," Margaret said. "I want quarterly reports on diversity metrics published publicly. I want community listening sessions held in neighborhoods this bank serves. And I want every executive to spend 1 week per year working frontline positions. Tellers, customer service, janitorial staff. They need to understand what it's like at every level." David was already taking notes. "All of it, absolutely." The meeting adjourned near midnight. Margaret was exhausted, but satisfied. Real change was happening. Not just words, not just promises, actual, measurable transformation. As she left the building, she found Thomas Chen waiting outside. "Mrs. Bennett, my daughter Angela wanted me to give you this," he said, handing her an envelope.
"She wanted to thank you in person, but she's doing emergency surgery in Seattle."
Margaret opened it. A handwritten letter and a check for $200,000. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Bennett, you saved my life when I was 14 years old. You saw potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. This donation can't repay what you did, but I hope it helps you save more lives like you saved mine. With eternal gratitude, Angela Chen, M.D." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. This was why she did it. Not for recognition, not for praise. For moments like this. For lives changed. For potential realized. A week later, the bank held a press conference to announce Margaret's board appointment. But before that happened, something unexpected occurred. Richard Whitmore sent a letter to every board member. It was handwritten, 12 pages long. In it, he confessed everything. The toxic culture he'd created, the employees he'd mistreated, the clients he'd discriminated against, the credit he'd stolen, the bonuses he'd manipulated, the small corruptions that have accumulated over years.
But more than confession, it was acknowledgement. He wrote about his grandfather, about learning cruelty as a business model, about believing wealth determined worth. He wrote about the past week, homeless and rejected, understanding for the first time what it felt like to be powerless. He wrote about contemplating suicide and deciding instead to try to be better. And at the end, he wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if there's any way I can help fix what I broke, any way I can contribute to making this bank better, I'm willing to do anything. Even if it means starting at the bottom, even if it means cleaning toilets. I just want a chance to prove I can change." The board met to discuss the letter. Opinions were divided. "He deserves nothing from us," one member said. "Let him suffer." "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," another countered. "If he's genuine about changing, shouldn't we give him a chance?" Margaret listened to them debate. Finally, she spoke. "I worked for his grandfather for 13 years, she said quietly. "Lawrence Whitmore was cruel, yes. But he was also a product of his time, his upbringing, his circumstances. Richard is a product of Lawrence. The question is, do we believe people can break cycles? Do we believe change is possible?" "Do you believe it?" Lorraine asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I believe pain can be a teacher. I believe hitting rock bottom can create clarity. I believe desperation can birth humility." She paused. "I also believe trust must be earned, not given." "What are you suggesting?" David asked. "Let him volunteer," Margaret said. "Not here. At community organizations, food banks, homeless shelters. Let him see the people he spent his career dismissing. If after 6 months of unpaid service he's still committed to change, we can discuss next steps." The board voted. 7 in favor, 2 against. Richard would get his chance, but it would be on Margaret's terms. When Richard received the letter informing him of the decision, he wept. Not from relief, from gratitude. From the overwhelming grace of being given an opportunity he didn't deserve. He started the next day at a food bank in the Bronx, serving meals to people who looked at him with the same dismissiveness he'd once shown others. It was humbling. It was painful. It was exactly what he needed. And Margaret, now officially a board member at First National Bank, began the work of transformation she'd been preparing for her entire life. The woman who'd walked in just wanting to check her balance had become the catalyst for institutional change. Justice wasn't just served, it was being rebuilt from the foundation up. Richard's first day at the Bronx Community Food Bank started at 5 in the morning. The supervisor, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, looked at him with undisguised contempt. "You're the banker," she said flatly. "The one from the video." "Yes," Richard said quietly. "You understand you're not getting paid for this?" "Yes. And you understand that if you mess up, if you show even a hint of that attitude you showed that old woman, I will personally make sure every news outlet in the city knows about it." "I understand." Carmen studied him. "Bathrooms down the hall. Needs cleaning. Toilets clogged. Mop and bucket are in the closet." Richard had never cleaned a toilet in his life. He'd had people to do that. People he'd never looked at twice, never learned their names, never considered their humanity. The smell made him gag. His hand shook as he plunged the toilet. Water splashed on his shoes, his pants. By the time he finished, he was covered in filth and shame. Carmen appeared in the doorway. "Good. Now the floor. Then the kitchen. Then you're on serving duty. Breakfast starts at 7. We'll have about 300 people." 300 people. Homeless. Struggling. The kind of people Richard had spent his career avoiding, dismissing, pretending didn't exist. At 6:55, the doors opened. They came in waves. elderly men with hollow eyes, young mothers carrying babies, teenagers who should have been in school, veterans with nowhere else to go. Richard stood behind the serving line, ladling oatmeal into bowls with trembling hands. An elderly black man approached. He looked at Richard, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're that banker," the man said. "From the TV." Richard's stomach dropped. "Yes." "Good," the man said. "You need to be here. You need to see us. We're not invisible anymore." The man took his bowl and walked away, dignity intact despite his circumstances. A young woman came next, maybe 25, holding a toddler. "Do you have extra?" she asked quietly. "For my daughter?" Richard filled her bowl to overflowing. "Of course." She looked at him with surprise, like kindness was unexpected. "Thank you." 4 hours later, Richard's feet ached. His back hurt. His hands were raw from washing dishes. He'd never worked this hard in his life, and this was just one day. These people did this every day, just to survive. Carmen found him slumped against the wall during his break. "Tomorrow, 5 a.m. again. Don't be late." "I'll be here," Richard said. "We'll see," Carmen replied. "Everyone says that on day 1. Most don't make it to day 7. Back at First National Bank, Janet Reynolds sat in her new office on the 15th floor. Her first executive meeting started in 10 minutes, and she was terrified. She'd prepared for 3 days, analyzed data, created presentations, practiced her talking points, but none of it felt adequate. David Morrison knocked on her open door. "Ready?" "No," Janet admitted. "What if they don't take me seriously? What if they think I'm only here because of what happened with Margaret?" "Then you prove them wrong," David said. "You've earned this position, Janet. Now show them why." The boardroom felt massive. Margaret sat at the far end, calm and observant. Lorraine Washington smiled encouragingly. Patricia Okonkwo nodded. But 2 board members, men in their 60s who'd been on the board for decades, looked skeptical. One of them, Gerald Hutchinson, didn't even glance up when Janet entered. "Let's begin," Lorraine said. "Janet, you have the floor. Present your client service reform proposal." Janet stood, her legs shaking. She clicked to her first slide. "Our current client satisfaction rating is 62%, she began. "Industry average is 78%. We're failing." Gerald Hutchinson finally looked up. "Those numbers are skewed. Our high-value clients are very satisfied. It's the low balance accounts dragging down the average." "Exactly," Janet said, her confidence building. "We're excellent at serving wealthy clients and terrible at serving everyone else. That's not a bank. That's a country club." The room went quiet. "I've analyzed 3 years of complaint data," Janet continued. 87% of complaints come from clients with balances under $50,000. Not because they're more difficult, because we treat them as less important. She clicked to the next slide. "I propose we eliminate minimum balance requirements for basic checking accounts. We implement same-day customer service response for all clients, regardless of account size. And we train every employee to treat every interaction as equally important." "That will cost millions," Gerald protested. "For what? Clients who contribute almost nothing to our bottom line?" Margaret spoke for the first time. "Mr. Hutchinson, do you know who I was before last week?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "A teacher, I believe." "A teacher with an $18 million account that your bank almost lost because your president judged me by my coat," Margaret said quietly. "How many other high-value clients are you losing because you can't see past appearances?" Gerald had no response. Janet clicked to her final slide. I did the math. If we implement these changes and retain just 5% more clients, we'll increase annual revenue by $42 million. This isn't charity, it's smart business. Lorraine smiled. Motion to approve Janet's proposal? Seconded, Patricia said immediately. The vote was 7 in favor, 2 abstaining. Gerald and his ally didn't vote yes, but they didn't vote no either. Janet had won her first battle. 3 weeks later, Margaret received a phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Bennett, this is Alicia Thompson. I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your class at PS 127 in 1995. Margaret thought for a moment. Alicia Thompson. Brilliant at geometry. Struggled with algebra. Wanted to be an architect. You remember, Alicia said, wonder in her voice. Mrs. Bennett, I'm calling because I saw what happened at the bank, and I need to tell you something. I'm a senator now, New York State Senate. I represent the district where PS 127 is located. Margaret's breath caught. Alicia, that's wonderful. It's because of you, Alicia said. You told me I could be anything. You helped me get into Cornell. You wrote letters of recommendation. You never gave up on me. She paused. I want to hold a hearing about discrimination in banking, about systemic bias, about what happened to you, and what happens to thousands of people every day. Will you testify? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Alicia, I'm not looking for attention. I'm not trying to be a symbol. I know, Alicia said gently. But your story matters. Your voice matters. And if we're going to change the system, we need people like you telling the truth about what it's really like. When? Margaret asked. 3 weeks, Albany. I'll handle everything. Transportation, accommodation, everything. Margaret agreed, knowing this would open doors she'd tried to keep closed. The news broke 2 days later. Senator Alicia Thompson announces banking discrimination hearings. Lead witness, Margaret Bennett, viral video victim and retired educator. The media frenzy started again, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just about one incident. It was about systemic change. Richard saw the news while mopping floors at the food bank. His hands stopped moving. Margaret was going to testify. She was going to tell her story to the state legislature, and his name would be attached to it forever. Carmen noticed him frozen. Keep working. Floors don't clean themselves. I destroyed her life, Richard whispered. No, Carmen said. You tried to destroy her dignity. She's using that moment to change the system. Big difference. A young man approached them, maybe 19, thin and exhausted looking. Excuse me, is there more coffee? I'll get it, Richard said, grateful for something to do. As he poured the coffee, the young man spoke quietly. You're Richard Whitmore, right? The banker? Richard tensed. Yes? My mom worked at your bank, the young man said. Janitorial staff. You fired her 2 years ago. Said she wasn't meeting standards, but really, it was because she asked for a raise. Richard's blood went cold. He didn't remember. Didn't remember the woman. Didn't remember firing her. She'd been invisible to him. I'm sorry, Richard said, the words inadequate. She died 6 months ago, the young man continued. Couldn't afford her insulin after she lost her job and insurance. She was 53. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back, the young man said. But maybe it stops you from doing it to someone else. He took the coffee and walked away, leaving Richard shaking. Carmen had heard everything. That's why you're here, she said quietly. Not to feel better about yourself, to understand what your choices cost. That night, Richard wrote another letter. this time to the young man, whose name he'd learned was David Martinez. In the letter, he apologized. He explained he had no defense, no excuse. He offered to help in any way he could.
3 days later, David Martinez showed up at the food bank. "I got your letter," he said to Richard. "I don't forgive you. I can't. But I appreciate that you didn't make excuses." "Your mother deserved better," Richard said. "I should have seen her, should have valued her, should have been better." David studied him. "You can't fix what you did to my mom, but maybe you can stop other people from making the same mistakes." "How?" Richard asked. "Tell your story," David said. "Tell people what happens when you treat people like they're disposable. Tell them what it costs." Richard nodded slowly. "I will, I promise." The day of the hearing arrived. Margaret sat in the witness chair before the New York State Senate Committee on Banking and Financial Services. 15 senators, 50 reporters, cameras everywhere. Senator Alicia Thompson led the questioning. "Mrs. Bennett, please tell us in your own words what happened on the morning of October 8th. Margaret spoke for 20 minutes. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just factually. What Richard said, what she felt, what the experience revealed about systemic discrimination. Then she said something that stopped everyone. "But I don't want to talk just about what happened to me. I want to talk about what happens every day to people who don't have $18 million to prove their worth." She pulled out a folder. "I contacted 50 people over the past month. Former students, community members, people who've experienced banking discrimination. With their permission, I'm sharing their stories." One by one, she read them. A black veteran denied a business loan despite excellent credit. A Latina woman charged higher interest rates than white applicants with lower scores. An elderly Asian man refused service because of his accent. The senators listened in silence. Some took notes furiously. Others looked sick. When Margaret finished, Senator Thompson asked, "What do you want to see change?" "Everything," Margaret said simply. "I want loan approval data published by race and ethnicity. I want mystery shopping programs to test for bias. I want penalties severe enough to actually change behavior. I want banking to be a right, not a privilege reserved for people who look a certain way." A conservative senator, James Wilson, pushed back. "Mrs. Bennett, with respect, banks are private businesses. We can't force them to serve unprofitable clients." "Senator Wilson," Margaret said calmly, "I was told I looked unprofitable. I had $18 million. How many other unprofitable clients are banks turning away because they can't see past bias?" The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. The hearing continued for 6 hours. Other witnesses testified. Banking executives squirmed under questioning. Data revealed patterns of discrimination across the industry. By the time it ended, 3 major pieces of legislation were proposed. The Margaret Bennett Banking Fairness Act, the Equal Access to Financial Services Act, the Community Banking Accountability Act. Margaret left the hearing exhausted but hopeful. Real change was possible. Back in the Bronx, Richard's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered anyway. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Senator Thompson. I'd like you to testify at our next hearing. About what you did, why you did it, what you've learned." Richard's heart pounded. "You want me to publicly admit to discrimination?" "I want you to be honest," Alicia said. "I want people to understand how this happens, how good people can make terrible choices, how systems enable bias." "I'm not a good person," Richard said quietly. "Then be a better one," Alicia replied. "Testify. Help us change things." Richard agreed, knowing it would destroy whatever remained of his reputation. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he needed to be destroyed completely to be rebuilt into someone worth being. At First National Bank, the changes continued. Minimum balance requirements eliminated. Customer service response times equalized. Mystery shoppers testing for bias weekly. And the results surprised everyone. Customer satisfaction jumped to 86%. New accounts increased 43%. Profit margins grew despite the costs. Treating people with dignity was good business.
Janet stood before the board, presenting quarterly results. We've retained 94% of clients who previously would have left due to fees or poor service. We've acquired 12,000 new accounts, and our Net Promoter Score is the highest in the industry.
Gerald Hutchinson, who'd been skeptical, spoke up. I was wrong. I apologize. This approach works. It was a small moment, but it mattered. Victoria Sterling had been volunteering at Margaret's scholarship program for 2 months. She worked with students applying to college, helping them navigate financial aid, prepare for interviews, write essays. One student, a 17-year-old named Jasmine, reminded Victoria of herself at that age. Privileged, entitled, completely unaware of how much others struggled. Why do you do this? Jasmine asked one day. You're rich. You could be doing anything. Victoria thought carefully. Because I spent 47 years believing money made me better than other people. And then I met someone who showed me how wrong I was. Now I'm trying to make up for lost time. Can you? Jasmine asked. Make up for it, I mean? No, Victoria said honestly. But I can try to do better going forward. That's all any of us can do. Jasmine nodded slowly, something shifting in her understanding. 6 weeks after the hearing, the first legislation passed. The Margaret Bennett Banking Fairness Act required all banks to publish annual reports on lending disparities by race, ethnicity, and zip code. Banks fought it, lobbied against it, claimed it was government overreach. But public pressure was too strong. The video of Margaret's humiliation had been viewed 80 million times worldwide. Her testimony had been covered by every major news outlet. The bill passed with bipartisan support. Margaret watched the vote from her apartment in Brooklyn. When it was official, she allowed herself to cry. Not from joy, from relief. The fight had been worth it. Her phone rang immediately. David Morrison. Margaret, we did it, he said, emotion thick in his voice. You did it, Margaret corrected. All of you at the bank. I just told the truth. Your truth changed everything, David said. Thank you. That night, Margaret received an email from Richard Whitmore. Subject line: I testified today. She opened it. Richard had appeared before the committee voluntarily, had confessed everything, had explained the culture of discrimination he'd created, had accepted full responsibility. The hearing had been brutal. Senators questioned him aggressively. Media tore him apart. But he'd endured it all without defending himself, without making excuses. At the end of his email, he wrote, I know I can never make this right, but I'm spending the rest of my life trying. Thank you for giving me the chance, Margaret wrote back. Just 2 words. Keep trying. Because that was all any of them could do. Keep trying. Keep working. Keep pushing for a world where dignity wasn't determined by bank balances, and respect wasn't reserved for people who looked a certain way. The transformation wasn't complete. It would never be complete. But it had begun. And sometimes, beginning was enough. 8 months after the hearing, Margaret turned 91. She didn't want a celebration, but the bank insisted. The lobby was filled with people whose lives she'd touched. Former students, scholarship recipients, board members, employees. Janet had organized everything. She stood at the microphone, her voice steady. Margaret Bennett changed this bank. She changed this industry. But more than that, she changed lives. She gestured to a young woman standing nearby.
This is Dr. Maya Johnson, Margaret's student from 2003, now a neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins. Maya stepped forward. Mrs. Bennett told me I was smart enough when everyone else said I wasn't. She paid for my MCAT prep. She believed in me. Her voice broke. I perform brain surgeries because a teacher refused to give up on me. One by one they spoke. Engineers, lawyers, teachers, scientists. Each one a testament to Margaret's lifetime of investment in potential others couldn't see. Then David Martinez stood, the young man whose mother Richard had fired, whose mother had died without insulin. Mrs. Bennett didn't know my mother, David said, but when she heard my story, she called me. She helped me finish my degree. She connected me with job opportunities. He paused. I start at the Department of Labor next month, working on worker protection policies. My mother would be proud. Margaret wiped her eyes. This was why she'd fought. Not for recognition. For this. For lives changed. For cycles broken. Richard Whitmore stood in the back of the lobby, watching. He hadn't been invited, but he'd come anyway. 6 months of volunteering at the food bank. 6 months of testimony and public humiliation. 6 months of trying to become someone different. Carmen from the food bank stood beside him. She'd driven him here, insisted he needed to see this. You need to talk to her, Carmen said. She doesn't want to see me, Richard replied. You don't know that until you try. The celebration continued for hours. When it finally ended, Margaret sat alone in a quiet corner, exhausted but happy. Richard approached slowly, his heart pounding. Mrs. Bennett, he said quietly. She looked up. No anger in her expression, just patient attention. I know I have no right to be here, Richard continued. But I needed to see this. Needed to understand what I almost destroyed. You didn't destroy anything, Margaret said simply. You revealed something that needed to be seen. I've been volunteering, Richard said. At the food bank, at homeless shelters. Trying to understand the people I spent my career ignoring. I know, Margaret said. Carmen emails me updates. Every week. Richard's breath caught. You've been following my progress? Of course, Margaret replied. I don't give people chances and then abandon them. That's not how change works. I met David Martinez's mother's former co-workers, Richard said, his voice shaking. 3 other women I fired for asking for fair wages. All of them struggled after losing their jobs. One became homeless. One lost her home. One died from a treatable condition because she couldn't afford medication. He sat down without permission, unable to stand anymore. I destroyed lives and never looked back. Never cared. Never saw them as human. And now you do, Margaret said. That's progress. It's not enough, Richard whispered. It will never be enough. No, Margaret agreed. But it's something. And something is better than nothing. She pulled an envelope from her purse. I received this yesterday. I want you to read it. Richard opened it. A letter from Richard's own daughter, Emily. She was 23, a recent college graduate. The letter explained that she'd seen the video, seen her father's humiliation, and it had forced her to examine her own prejudices. She'd started volunteering at an immigrant support center. Started questioning the privilege she'd always taken for granted. Started becoming the person her father had never been. Your daughter is doing good work, Margaret said. She's breaking the cycle you inherited from your grandfather. That matters. Richard's hand shook. I haven't spoken to her in 8 months. She won't return my calls. Give her time, Margaret said gently. Healing isn't linear. Forgiveness isn't automatic, but transformation is possible. Janet approached them, surprised to see Richard. Should I call security? No, Margaret said. Mr. Whitmore was just leaving. Richard stood, understanding the dismissal. "Thank you for talking to me, for not hating me." "I don't hate you," Margaret said. "I pity the man you were, but I have hope for the man you're becoming." Richard left, Carmen waiting for him outside. "How'd it go?" Carmen asked. "She's a better person than I'll ever be," Richard said. "Then keep trying to close the gap," Carmen replied. 3 weeks later, First National Bank made an announcement that shocked the industry. They were establishing the Margaret Bennett Institute for Financial Equity, a research center dedicated to studying and eliminating bias in banking. David Morrison stood at the press conference. "We're committing $100 million over 10 years. This institute will develop tools for measuring bias, create training programs, publish research, and hold the entire industry accountable." Reporters shouted questions. "Why now?" one asked. "Because Margaret Bennett proved we can do better," David said. "Because dignity shouldn't be a luxury. Because banking should build communities, not exploit them." Margaret sat on the stage, uncomfortable with the attention. When reporters turned to her, she kept her answers brief. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about making sure the next person who walks into a bank is treated with respect, regardless of what they're wearing or what they look like." But privately, to David, she said something else. "I'm 91 years old. I'm tired. I need someone to carry this forward." "Janet," David said immediately. "She should run the institute." Janet, when told, was speechless. "I'm not qualified. I'm not a researcher." "I'm not—" "You're exactly qualified," Margaret interrupted. "You understand banking from the inside. You know where the bias hides. You know what needs to change." "What if I fail?" Janet whispered. "Then you'll have failed trying to make the world better," Margaret said. "That's more honorable than succeeding at keeping it broken." Janet accepted, terrified and determined in equal measure. The institute launched 6 months later. Its first major project, a nationwide study of lending discrimination. The results were devastating and undeniable. Black applicants with perfect credit scores were denied at rates 37% higher than white applicants with identical profiles. Latino applicants were charged interest rates averaging 2.3% higher. Asian applicants faced longer approval times and more documentation requirements. The data couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be explained away, couldn't be ignored. Within months, 3 major banks were facing federal investigations. 5 CEOs were forced to resign. The industry was in crisis. But from crisis came change. New regulations passed. Bias testing became mandatory. Penalties for discrimination increased tenfold. Banks that failed to address disparities lost federal insurance. And slowly, measurably, things improved. Margaret watched it all from her apartment in Brooklyn. She'd stopped coming to board meetings regularly. The stairs were too hard. The energy required too much. But she stayed connected. Phone calls with Janet weekly, updates from David, letters from scholarship recipients. One morning, a knock on her door. She opened it to find Victoria Sterling, carrying groceries. "You don't need to do this," Margaret said. "I know," Victoria replied, "but I want to." For 6 months, Victoria had been visiting weekly, bringing groceries, running errands, listening to Margaret's stories. It had started as penance. It had become genuine friendship. "I spoke at my daughter's school yesterday," Victoria said as she unpacked food, "about privilege and responsibility, about how I grew up thinking money made me better than others." "How did it go?" Margaret asked. "Terribly," Victoria admitted. "The kids asked hard questions. Why did it take me 47 years to figure out something so obvious? Why should they listen to someone who was part of the problem for so long?" "What did you say?" "That they were right to be skeptical. That I don't deserve their respect just because I suddenly decided to be better. That I'm sharing my story not as a hero,
but as a warning. Margaret smiled. That's the right answer. Victoria sat down, her expression serious. Margaret, I need to tell you something. I'm selling my company. All of it. $200 million. Margaret's eyebrows raised. Why? Because I realized something. I spent my whole life accumulating wealth and using it to feel superior. That ends now. She paused. I'm donating $150 million to your scholarship fund. The rest goes to affordable housing, food security programs, and community development. Victoria, that's your entire fortune. No, Victoria said firmly. My fortune was being in the same room when you showed everyone what real wealth looks like. This is just money, and money only matters when you use it to matter. Margaret reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. Your grandfather would be horrified. Good, Victoria said. That means I'm finally doing something right. Richard Whitmore's redemption took a different path. After a year of volunteering, he applied for a position at a nonprofit called Second Chance Employment Services. They helped formerly incarcerated people find jobs. The director, a woman named Keisha Williams, interviewed him personally. Why should I hire you? She asked bluntly. You're the banker who humiliated an elderly black woman on camera. You represent everything wrong with privilege and power. You shouldn't hire me, Richard said honestly. I don't deserve this opportunity, but I'm asking anyway, because I want to spend the rest of my life helping people I used to ignore. What's changed? Keisha demanded. I lost everything, Richard said. My job, my wife, my reputation, my identity. And I learned that everything I thought made me valuable was actually worthless. The only thing that matters is how you treat people. That's it. That's everything. Keisha studied him. This job pays $42,000 a year. That's probably less than you spent on shoes when you were a banker. I know. You'll be working with people who've been in prison, who've struggled with addiction, who faced discrimination you can't imagine. Some of them will be hostile to you. Some will test you. Some will fail despite your best efforts. I understand. Why do this? Keisha asked. Why not just disappear? Move to another city. Start over somewhere nobody knows your face. Richard thought carefully. Because running away doesn't teach me anything. Because I need to face the consequences of who I was. Because maybe, just maybe, my story can help someone else avoid making the same mistakes. Keisha hired him on a probationary basis. 6 months to prove himself. He lasted 3 weeks before his first major test. A client, a man named Jerome, who'd spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, recognized Richard from the video. You're that racist banker, Jerome said loudly in the office. Everyone stopped working. You're the one who treated that old woman like trash. Richard didn't deny it. Yes. And now you work here, helping people like me? That's rich. Jerome laughed bitterly. You probably think you're some kind of hero. Reformed racist, trying to save the poor black people. No, Richard said quietly. I'm trying to learn what I should have known my whole life. That people deserve dignity, regardless of their circumstances. You don't have to work with me. I'll assign you to another counselor if you prefer. Jerome stared at him. You know what the worst part about people like you is? You get to mess up, apologize, and move on. People like me mess up once, and it follows us forever. You're right, Richard said. That's unfair. I can't fix that. But I can try to help you find employment, despite a system that's rigged against you. Jerome considered this. Fine. Help me then, but I'm watching you. One hint of that attitude, and I'm gone. Fair enough, Richard agreed. 6 months later, Jerome landed a job as a construction supervisor. 3 months after that, he was promoted to site manager. A year later, he called Richard.
"I'm buying a house," Jerome said. "First person in my family to own property. I wanted you to know." Richard's voice shook. "I'm proud of you, Jerome."
"Don't be," Jerome said, but his tone was softer. "This is my achievement, not yours. But you helped. I'll give you that." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that was enough. Margaret's 92nd birthday arrived quietly. She'd asked for no celebration, just a small gathering at her apartment. Janet came, David Morrison, Victoria, Carmen from the food bank, a dozen former students. But the surprise guest was Emily Whitmore, Richard's daughter.
"Mrs. Bennett," Emily said nervously, "I hope it's okay that I came. Janet told me about the gathering." "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "I've heard wonderful things about your work at the Immigrant Center." "I wanted to thank you," Emily said, "not just for what you did at the bank, but for what you did for my father." Margaret was confused. "I didn't do anything for your father, except tell him the truth." "Exactly," Emily said. "You held up a mirror and forced him to see himself. That moment changed him. He's not the man he was." She paused. "I still haven't forgiven him. Maybe I never will. But I can see he's trying to be better, and that matters." She handed Margaret an envelope. "I graduate with my master's in social work next month. This is my thesis. It's about breaking cycles of privilege and prejudice. You're in it. My father's in it. Our whole story is there." Margaret opened the envelope, scanned the first page. The title, "How One Moment Can Shatter and Rebuild: A Case Study in Institutional Discrimination and Personal Transformation." "May I keep this?" Margaret asked. "It's yours," Emily said. "Everything I learned came from watching you." That evening, after everyone left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment. 92 years old, tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix, but satisfied. She thought about the scholarship fund, now worth over $200 million thanks to Victoria's donation. She thought about the Margaret Bennett Institute, changing policy across the industry. She thought about the laws passed, the lives changed, the cycles broken. She thought about Richard Whitmore, working at a nonprofit for a fraction of his former salary, slowly becoming someone worthy of respect. She thought about Janet Reynolds, running an institute that was transforming banking. She thought about her students, scattered across the country, doctors and lawyers and teachers and engineers, all carrying forward the lessons she'd taught them. Your worth isn't determined by others. It's determined by how you treat others. Her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Bennett, this is Alicia Thompson. I have news. The Senate just passed the final banking reform bill. Every piece of legislation we discussed, all of it, signed into law." Margaret closed her eyes. "Thank you for calling, Alicia." "No," Alicia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything, for teaching me, for fighting, for refusing to stay silent." The call ended. Margaret sat in silence, feeling the weight of 92 years. She'd spent 40 years teaching, 50 years investing in others, 9 decades proving that dignity mattered more than dollars. And in the end, one moment, one confrontation, one refusal to accept disrespect had changed everything. Not because she was special, not because she was a hero, but because she refused to let cruelty win. She picked up a pen and paper, wrote one final letter. "To anyone who reads this, I'm not a hero. I'm a teacher who got tired of watching people treated like they didn't matter. I'm a woman who saved money so others could get educated. I'm someone who refused to let a bank president decide my worth. That's all. That's everything. If my story teaches anything, let it be this. Your dignity belongs to you, not to bosses or banks or systems or people in power. You. And no one can take it unless you let them. Fight for yourself. Fight for others. Make the world better than you found it. That's the only legacy that matters. She signed it simply, Margaret. 3 days later, Margaret Bennett passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 92 years old. The funeral filled 3 churches. Students, colleagues, strangers whose lives she'd touched. Richard Whitmore sat in the back, weeping quietly. Victoria Sterling delivered a eulogy about redemption. Janet Reynolds spoke about transformation. David Morrison could barely speak at all. But the moment that mattered most came from a young girl, maybe 8 years old, a scholarship recipient's daughter. "My mama says Mrs. Bennett is why I get to go to a good school," the girl said into the microphone, her voice small but clear. "I never met her, but I'm going to make her proud. I'm going to be a teacher too, and I'm going to help people like she did." That was Margaret's legacy. Not the $18 million, not the laws passed or policies changed, but the 8-year-old girl who'd already decided to spend her life lifting others. The cycle Margaret started would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by hundreds of people she'd invested in, generation after generation, proving that one person choosing dignity over cruelty could change the entire world. Because that's what Margaret Bennett had done. She walked into a bank just wanting to check her balance. She walked out, having demolished an empire built on discrimination, and replaced it with something better. And every person who ever walked through those doors afterward would be treated with respect, because one 90-year-old woman refused to accept anything less. That wasn't just justice. That was legacy.